So what is Tantra Yoga really? Is it sexual yoga? Is it wild sexual orgy yoga? No. Well, maybe. Definitely not the wild sexual orgy part, but it can be sexual. Parts of Tantra Yoga can be sexual. Let's talk about the true meaning and clear up some misconceptions. The literal translation for Tantra is to loom, to weave, to include. They were very non-dogmatic. They embraced all the different styles and philosophies of yoga, which can sometimes, different styles of yoga can be very judgmental. They can be very dogmatic. They can make other styles wrong. They can make the methods to get to the same goal of enlightenment wrong, which sort of is a dichotomy for yoga, because yoga is all about union and connection. So why make somebody else wrong? Just if you don't agree with that particular style, just don't do it. Tantric yoga, however, was very inclusive. Now, there are many different types of Tantric yoga, many different approaches to the same subject, just like there are with hatha yoga, just like there are with Raja yoga. The first particular group of Tantric yogis were the Buddhist Tantric yogis, followed very closely by the Hindu equivalents. Now, in the Hindu realm, the first path is called the right path. They're very conservative. They want to be included in the Indian society, so they interpreted the rituals of Tantra, because Tantra can be very ritualistic, in a symbolic rather than a literal way, because they still wanted to be accepted by society. But then there were the left path. So we have the Buddhists, the right path, the conservatives. Now the left path were the extremists. The left path Tantrikas went overboard. Some of them were sexual. Some of them were celibate. Some of them saw the physical world as a complete illusion that they call Maya. But many of them would overindulge as almost as hedonists. And then the next path, the kaula path of Tantra Yoga, that's where the big drum roll comes in. The kaula path of Tantra Yoga, because we're about to get to the birthplace of another type of yoga that I know you're very familiar with. The kaula path was a combination of the right and left path. But before I continue, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. Smash that like button if you're enjoying this video. You want to learn all about yoga, hot yoga, tutorials, flows, factoids. Hit the subscribe button right now. But what are the metaphors that I like to use? Imagine there's a bowl of cookies, and the cookies represent your sexual desires. I mean, it really could represent any kind of desire for food, whatever. But just imagine it represents the sexual desire. The right path, and the conservatives and the traditionalists would not eat a cookie. They would not delve into their sexual urge. Instead, they would repurpose it. They would channel that energy from the lower chakras to the higher chakras. In other words, they wouldn't want to suppress it. We all know what happens when you suppress sexuality, it runs rampant. So it's not suppressed, it's rechanneled from the lower chakras to the higher chakras to use your sexual desire for the desire for God. So you bring it up to the higher chakras. Therefore, that energy shoots up. Now, the left path guys, the crazies, they were hedonists to an extent. I mean, ideally, they weren't hedonists for their own self-pleasure, which we can talk about in a second. But the left path Tantrikas would eat every single cookie in that bowl. They would eat those cookies until they were sick of it, and then they would transcend that desire. You might have seen the documentary on Netflix called Wild Wild Country. It was about a very powerful yogi, even though they really didn't mention that he was a yogi, and they didn't mention that he was a left path Tantrika. By the way, if you practice Tantra Yoga, you are a Tantrika. His nickname was Osho, but his real name was Rajneesh. Very powerful yogi. He had tons of wonderful books and videos that he put out over the years. He had this massive group, an ashram in a rural town in Oregon. You have to watch that documentary, Wild Wild Country. But they were left path Tantrikas, and they would then indulge in these sexual rituals. Now, there was one ritual they actually got on tape, and that's one of the ways that, according to the documentary, that was part of their demise, because it got out to the world, and the world sort of freaked out over them, and they tried to close them down. But this particular ritual is called Macha Makara, or the 5 M's. So what they would do, as an aphrodisiac, they would drink wine, they would eat meat, and if they were vegetarians, which is sort of a traditional yogic way, it would start to get the sexual juices flowing. They would eat some kind of fish, drink some kind of wine, or they'd eat some kind of wheat or grain. In Sanskrit, they all started with the letter M, so they called them the 5 M's. And then 5 couples would sit around in a circle with the guru or the leader of the group in the middle, and the 5 couples would be in sexual intercourse. The guru's job in the center, or the leader of the group in the center, was to make sure that the couples were not indulging in the sexual activity for their own self-pleasure, but to use the sexual energy as a means toward union. And this is really the whole concept of tantric sexuality. It's not about your own self-pleasure in the sexual act, but it's about becoming one with the other person. When you have this union with the other person, you're no longer separate. When you have this, especially if you're in love with the other person, there's a sexual union that takes place. There's a sexual bond that takes place, and you are no longer separate in that moment. This is one of the main concepts of yoga, is that we find connection, union with the universe. So we're using the sexual partner as a glimpse to what that's like. So we're no longer alone. We're no longer just about our own self. We're connected to the higher self and to the universe and to the consciousness. So now what they're doing is they're lighting up all the chakras at once. They're not channeling all that sexual energy which lays in the lower chakras. They're lighting them all up, all 7 chakras at the same time. Completely different than the traditionalists, where they're just lighting up the top chakras. Now here comes the third part of that metaphor. The traditionalists and the right path tantrikas would not eat any cookie. They would rechannel it, repurpose that energy to a higher place. The left path would eat every single cookie in that bowl until they were sick of it. The kaula path had a different philosophy. The kaula path would take one cookie on occasion and they would savor it. The reason why it would be on occasion, it would not be as excessive as the left path, because the body was the temple, what they call in yoga the vajradeha, the diamond body. The diamond body doesn't necessarily mean the physical body is a temple. The physical body is the channel, is the vehicle. It's to brighten the aura of the ethereal body. So the physical and the ethereal body become one, and they would not want to indulge in an extreme way, because that would definitely upset the vajradeha. And then there's a sexual ritual. Now, the Tantric yogis had a different interpretation of brahmacharya. We talked about the traditionalist way, and even Patanjali was about abstinence. It was about not indulging in the sexual activity. But for the Tantric yogis, and the kaula path specifically, and definitely the left path, but the kaula path specifically, in the sexual act, especially the man, would not have the release of the orgasm. They would go just to that point. And how they would do it was a particular mudra. They'd actually put their finger down below the genitals and they would push in so that they would take the energy up the center channel or up the sushumna. So what they had in common with the traditionalists is that they would not release the sexual energy. They would go just to that point of orgasm and stay at that position. And they had to control, more mental than it was physical, not to have the final orgasm, but just be at that peak. I don't know if you ever heard, years ago, Sting had talked about he would have an hour orgasm. What he was talking about, the concept is he never had the release. It was just to that point. And that's where the whole tantric sexuality comes in. It's not about your own pleasure. It's not about being the sexual stud that you can be in the act for hours at a time. It was about the union with the other person, the love for the other person, and that sexual bond that you are no longer separate in that moment. And when that happens, the energy shoots up that center channel we call the sushumna nadi. It's another way of manipulating the kundalini shakti. I recently did a video on hatha yoga and talked all about the kundalini shakti, which is a big part of hatha yoga. Now, the whole tantric philosophy really didn't come into fruition until about 500-600 CE, or in Western terms it would be AD. It didn't really take off until the year 1000 CE. However, we can trace back tantric philosophy to Vedic times, to way back in the pre-classical times, but it really didn't come into fruition until much later on, about 1,000 years ago. It was a different way of approaching the subject of yoga. A more traditional approach to yoga, we can go back to the traditionalist or in the pre-classical time, was very conservative. And to this day, India is a very conservative country. You won't even see people kissing on television or in movies. The whole Kama Sutra, the whole tantric sexuality thing is underground in India. They haven't had the sexual revolution like we've had in the West. And one traditional concept in yoga is to rid yourself of desire. In fact, Krishna at the Bhagavad Gita tells Arjuna in his conversation, which is really the conversation between man and God. It's a very symbolic and one of the most sacred scriptures in all of India, the Bhagavad Gita. And Krishna says, rid yourself of desire to find me. Rid yourself of desire to find God. So the extremists saw that the body and desire was a distraction from our final goal of reaching samadhi, final goal of reaching enlightenment. And that's definitely the traditional approach. Even in Patanjali's time, which was thousands of years after the traditionalist, about 2,000 years ago, Patanjali's prescription for yoga was for the yogis to go up into meditation for long periods of time to quiet the mind, go in the caves of the Himalayas. Now, he wasn't as an extremist to give up the body. He was a proponent of keeping the body strong and healthy so you could sit for meditation for long periods of time. You may want to check out this video I did a few weeks back. In fact, brahmacharya, which is the fourth yama, if you're a student or a teacher of yoga, you should know the 8-limb path. The first limb are the yamas, or the restrictions. The fourth yama is brahmacharya. What does it literally mean? It literally means to return chara to the Brahman, to the universe. But how the traditionalists interpreted brahmacharya was abstinence from sexuality. So that if you abstain from your sexual desire, your sexual instinct, that's how you will find God. So therefore you can see brahmacharya for the traditionalists, even for Patanjali, was about abstinence. So now we move ahead about 1,000 years after Patanjali, and here comes this whole new concept of yoga called Tantra Yoga. And the Tantric philosophy was that we don't have to necessarily give up our desire. We don't have to give up the bodily pleasures and our mental, emotional pleasures to find enlightenment. In fact, we can use our energy, we can use our body as a vehicle to find God. So here came a whole different philosophy, definitely contrasting the traditionalists who want to give up their desire. The Tantric yogis embrace their desire, but let's talk about exactly how they do that. Now bear with me for a little bit longer. I know some of you might have clicked on this video to learn all about tantric sexuality. We're going to get to that in a second. But the whole concept of the kaula path, let's go back to the birth of kaula yoga. Shiva's at the bottom of the ocean, and he's lecturing his wife Parvati. Shiva would always go at the bottom of the ocean like Neptune or Poseidon. He had his trident, and he's lecturing his wife Parvati, also known as Uma, as in Uma Thurman, and he's lecturing his wife, but he finds she's fallen asleep. And he says, has anybody heard my words of wisdom? Now a fish earlier on had swallowed a very powerful yogi. Back then he wasn't a yogi. His name is Matsyendra, and he's at the bottom of the ocean in the belly of the fish. And he says, I heard you, master. So now instead of initiating his wife Parvati, he initiates Matsyendra, who had heard his dissertation, his lecture on Tantric Yoga. Now the fish is caught 12 years later. They open up the belly of the fish, and out comes Matsyendra. He takes such a turn and twist in his life that they name the spine twist after him. But the concept, that's why they call it Ardha Matsendrasana, half Lord of the Fishes, after this guy. But what Matsyendra did, based on Shiva's teachings, was create the kaula path of Tantra Yoga, and let's talk about exactly what that is. One of the many things that Shiva was teaching Matsyendra at the bottom of the ocean was that we can use our bodies as a vehicle to find enlightenment, as a vehicle to find God, as a vehicle for the immersion into the universe, specifically the spine and the brain. Therefore, the body was a sacred temple, definitely not to be discarded as an illusion like many of the traditionalists thought. By the way, if you're interested in the Barkan method teacher training programs, I put links in the description below. Now back to Matsyendra, his number one disciple was Goraksha. Goraksha then creates a particular group called the Kampata sect, and out of that comes, here's another drum roll, Hatha Yoga. So hatha, that's actually how you pronounce it properly, not hatha, but hatha. Hatha yoga means the forceful awakening, once again, check out that video, of the Kundalini Shakti up that center channel. And that's the true meaning of hatha yoga. So if you are a practitioner of a forceful style of yoga, forceful style of asana, vinyasa, Bikram, Barkan, Iyengar, Ashtanga, traditional vinyasa, you are a practitioner of hatha yoga, which comes from tantric yoga. Therefore, you are all tantrikas. Like it or not, you are tantric yogis, not what Patanjali would call Ashtanga yogis. And check out this video I did a few weeks back on Ashtanga yoga as well. So to sum it up, the concept of sexuality in the tantric version was not about your own personal pleasure. It's about the connection and the union with that other person, the bond that you have with that other person to bring that sexual energy up that center channel to literally find enlightenment. It was a vehicle to samadhi, completely different approach, so different than the traditionalist tantric yoga. So that's our episode for today. Thank you so much for watching. I know this particular video was a little bit different than I normally do. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, hit the notification bell, smash the like button, and I will see you. If you like these kind of videos, I'll do more of them. Let me know. I'll see you at the next video. Bye, everyone.